Dear students, in this lesson, we are going to deal with the important social, political concepts like caste, untouchability, identity, Dr. Ambedkar and the Indian Constitution, constitutional democracy, and economic exploitation. Caste. Dr. Ambedkar's understanding of caste and the caste system underwent certain significant changes over the period of his writings. Initially, he had argued that the characteristics of caste was endogamy superimposed on exogamy in a shared cultural ambience. He suggested that such evil as sati, child marriage, and the prohibition on widow remarriage were the outcome of the caste. Further, if a caste closed its boundaries, other castes were also forced to follow it. The Brahmins closing themselves socially first gave rise to the system of castes. Ambedkar continued to emphasize the endogamous characteristics of caste, but roped on other features such as the division of labor, absence of interdining, and the principles of birth, which he had earlier largely observed within endogamy. He also found that the caste name is an important feature which keeps the solidarity of caste intact. He increasingly argued that graded inequality is the normative anchor of the caste system. Graded inequality restricts the reach of equality to members of the caste at the most. Ambedkar thought caste is an essential feature of Hindu religion. Although a few reformers may have denounced it, for the vast majority of Hindus, breaking the codes of caste is a clear violation of deeply held religious beliefs. He found Gandhi subscribing to caste initially and later opposing it but upholding Varna instead. Ambedkar, however, felt that the principle underlying Gandhi's conception of Varna is same as that of caste, that is, assigning social agents on the basis of birth rather than worth. It led to upholding graded inequality and the denial of freedom and equality, social relations that cannot beget community bonds. The solution that Ambedkar proposed was the annihilation of caste. He suggested intercaste marriage and interdining for the purpose, although the latter by itself is too weak to forge any enduring bonds. Further, he felt that hereditary priesthood should go and it should remain open to all, and co-religionists endowed with appropriate qualifications as certified by the state. Ambedkar, however, felt that these suggestions would not be acceptable to Hindus. After the early 1930s, he gave up any hope of reforming Hinduism except for a brief while with the Hindu Code Bill, which was in the way, the constitution of the agenda that he had set for himself in 1920s. Untouchability. Ambedkar's engagement with untouchability as a researcher, an intellectual and activist is much more nuanced, hesitant but timid as compared to his viewpoint on caste, where he is prepared to offer stronger judgment and tender solutions. However, with untouchability, there is often failure of words. Grief is merged with anger. He often exclaims how an institution of this kind has been tolerated and even defended. He evinces deep suspicions about the bona fides of other in terms of their engagement with it. He distinguished the institution of untouchability from that of caste, although the former is reinforced by the latter, and Brahmanism constituted the enemy of both. He felt that it was difficult for outsiders to understand the phenomena of untouchability and explored modes of presenting the same. Once explained, he thought human sympathy would be forthcoming towards alleviating the plight of the untouchables, but at the same time anticipated hurdles to be crossed, hurdles made of age-old prejudices, interests, religious retribution, the burden of the social pyramid above, and the feeble resources that the untouchables could muster. He found that the colonial administration did little to ameliorate the lot of the untouchables. He argued that the track record of Islam and Christianity in this regard is not praiseworthy either, although they may not subscribe to untouchability as integral to their religious beliefs. He felt that untouchables have to fight their own battle, and if others are concerned about them, then such a concern has to be expressed in helping them to fight rather than prescribing solution to them. He discussed attempts to deny the existence of untouchables and to reduce the proportion of their population in order to deny them adequate political presence. He restored to comparison with what he called the parallel cases, such as the treatment method out to slaves and Jews, but found the lot of the untouchables worse than theirs. He argued that in spite of differences and cleavages, all untouchables share common disadvantages and treatment from caste Hindus. They live in gutters, they were universally despised and kept us outside the fold. He maintained a graphic account of the course of movement of the untouchables, although this account was much more specific about the movement in the Bombay Presidency. He threw scorn at the Gandhian attempt to remove untouchability and termed it as a mere facade aimed at buying over the untouchables with kindness. He presented voluminous empirical data to defend such a thesis and suggested his own strategies to confront untouchability, warning untouchables not to fall into the trap of Gandhism. He exhorted them to fight for political power. Although he did not find the lot of untouchables better among Christians and Muslims, he felt that they had a better option as they did not subscribe to untouchability as a religious tenet. Ambedkar rarely went into the question of the origin of untouchability in history. He rebutted the suggestion that race had anything to do with it and did not subscribe to the position that caste has its basis in race either. However, in one instance, he proposed a very imaginative thesis that untouchables were broken men living on the outskirts of village communities who, due to their refusal to give up Buddhism and beef eating, came to be condemned as untouchables. He did not repeat this thesis in any central way later and did not justify the conversion to Buddhism as going back to the fold either. It has to be noted that the thesis was proposed when Ambedkar was fighting for the recognition that untouchables were a separate element in India and therefore should be constitutionally endowed with the appropriate safeguards, while the colonial administration and Gandhian leadership were prepared to recognize only the Muslims and Sikhs as distant communities. Identity. As in the case of untouchables, Ambedkar attempted to construct a separate identity of Sudras and this too during the second half of the 40s. He identified himself with the non-Brahmins and attempted to build a non-Aryan Naga identity, ascribing to it the single achievements of Indian civilization. He also proposed to write on the clash of Aryan and the Nagas much more elaborated than he was to do. However, his exploration of Naga identity remained quite thin. We can find in Ambedkar's works a great deal of detail about primitive tribes and what were called criminal tribes. He saw them basically as outside the pale of civilization and blamed Hinduism for confining them to such subhuman levels. He ridiculed the Hindus for applauding their attitude to such degradation in the name of toleration. Ambedkar, however, did not explore the tribal cultures and did not attempt to build a political bridgehead with them, although in terms of deprivation he felt the untouchables and these communities formed a common constituency. Ambedkar did recognize various other identities in India such as subcaste, caste, a grouping of castes such as touchables and untouchables, twice born or regenerated castes, and Sudras, religious groups, regional identities, and sometimes identities resulting from the mutual reinforcement of all these groups. Ambedkar acknowledged the presence of linguistics and cultural identities, but he was deeply suspicious of them. It is not so much their tendency to cast themselves as a nationality that makes him apprehensive, but their tendency to exclude minorities that do not share the dominant identity. He, however, considered the fact of the identity seriously, going to the length of suggesting that he was a conservative, but arguing that identity should be within the bounds of the rule of law. The demands of the development, justice and participation. For the same reason, the ideal solution for the problems of linguistic states is not one language, one state, but one state, one language. Social reforms in India were increasingly fragmented into regional ambits by the first decade of the 20th century, becoming part of the emerging regional identities. Ambedkar also took an active interest in the working class movement and sometimes occupied formal positions in the trade unions. He understood their concerns as he had lived in a working class locality for over 2 decades. However, he felt that Indian working class had not come to address the caste question. On the contrary, the division of labor in the industrial establishment was based on the caste relations, and he pointed out that as long as the working class was fragmented into castes, their common bond would prove too fragile to wage determined struggles. Ambedkar and the Indian Constitution. The first President of India, Dr. Rajendra Prasad, praised the services rendered by Dr. Ambedkar in the making of the Constitution and said, "I have carefully watched the day-to-day activities from the presidential seat. Therefore, I appreciate more than others with how much dedication and vitality this task has been carried out by the chairman, Dr. B.R.Ambedkar in particular. We never did a better thing than having Dr. Ambedkar on the draft committee and selecting him as its chairman. Due to his seminal role in the framing of the Indian Constitution, Dr. Ambedkar is popularly known all over India as the chief architect of Indian Constitution. His efforts to eradicate social evils were remarkable, and that is why he is called the Messiah of the Dalits and downtrodden in India. Dr. Ambedkar was appointed as the chairman of the Constitution Draft Committee. The text prepared by Ambedkar provided constitutional guarantees and protections for the wide range of civil liberties for individual citizens, including freedom of religion, the abolition of untouchability, and outlawing all forms of discriminations. He provided an inspiring preamble to the Constitution, ensuring justice, social, economic, and political liberty, equality, and fraternity. The creation of an egalitarian social order, however, remains an unfulfilled wishful thinking to this day. Dr. Ambedkar was not only a learned scholar and an eminent jurist, but also a revolutionary who fought against social evils like untouchability and caste restrictions. Throughout his life, he battled the social discrimination while upholding the rights of the Dalits and other social backward classes. He was not only a great national leader, but also a distinguished scholar of international repute. He not only led various social movements for the upliftment of the depressed sections of the Indian society, but also contributed to the understanding of socio-economic and political problems of India through his scholarly works on caste, religion, culture, constitutional law, and economic development. As a matter of fact, he was an economist, and his various scholarly works and speeches indicate his deep understanding of the problems faced by Indian society. He was appointed as the nation's first law minister and was posthumously awarded the Bharat Ratna in 1990. The text prepared by Ambedkar provided constitutional guarantees and protections for the wide range of civil liberties for individual citizens, the abolition of untouchability, and the outlawing of all form of discrimination. Ambedkar argued for extensive economic and social rights for women and also won Assembly's support by introducing a system of civil services, schools and colleges for members of the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, a system akin to affirmative action. India's lawmakers hoped to eradicate the socio-economic inequalities for India's depressed classes through these measures. The Constitution was adopted on 26th November 1949 by the Constituent Assembly. Ambedkar resigned from the cabinet in 1951 following the installing in Parliament of his draft of the Hindu Code Bill, which sought to expound gender equality in the laws of inheritance and marriage. Ambedkar independently contested an election in 1952 to the lower house of Parliament, the Lok Sabha, but was defeated. He was appointed to the upper house of Parliament, the Rajya Sabha, in March 1952 and would remain as member till his death. Constitutional democracy. The major area of Ambedkar's work was on constitutional democracy. He was skilled at interpreting in different constitutions of the world, particularly those that matters insofar as they were committed to the democracy along with their constitutional developments. This becomes obvious if we note the references that he adduces to the different constitution in the debates of the Constituent Assembly. He was the key player in the constitutional developments of India from the mid-1920s, and on certain issues such as the Uniform Civil Code, he was to anticipate some of the major issues that have been the topics for debate in India. Ambedkar evolved certain basic principles of constitutionalism for the complex polity like India, but argued that ultimately their resilience would depend on constitutional ethics. Ambedkar dwelt on several substantive issues of law. In fact, we can understand the significance that law had in his scheme of things by recourse to his larger social and ideological understanding. He was deeply sensitive to the interface between law on one hand and customs and popular beliefs on the other. He felt that law was definitely influenced by customs and popular beliefs, but stressed that customs may defend parochial interest but may not uphold fairness and may be based on their usefulness for the dominant classes. They may not be in tune with the demands of time or in consonance with normality and reason. Ambedkar also admitted the possibility of customs having the upper hand over law when they began to defend vested interests, but that with the emphasis on freedom and democracy, law would be placed in the service of the common good. On the other hand, customs, while promoting healthy pluralism, may give rise to the highly egalitarian order. At the same time, he defers to the pluralism if it can uphold rights. In all these qualifications, his contention is that the legal domain is an autonomous sphere. Ambedkar also deployed a complex understanding of rights to situate the domain of law. He distinguished the realm of constitutional law from the acts of legislature, but acknowledged that popular aspirations and the democratic mandate was the common ground for both. At the same time, it is law which determines what are popular and democratic aspirations and what constitute the relevant categories given the existence of the domain of the right. He did not reconcile the tension between democracy and law, and in his exposition of the domain of reason and morals are often in concentration with that of law. Ideally, of course, he also Ambedkar's views on constitutional democracy were reflected in his relations with Gandhi and Nehru on the issues of untouchability, the Hindu Code Bill respectively. Economic exploitation. For Ambedkar, economic exploitation was a major issue to contend against. It explains his lifelong critical engagement with Marxism. However, he felt that there are other sources of exploitation and marginalization besides economic exploitation which deprive people of those basic goods indispensable for the constitution of a confident self, a life of mutual recognition and participation in collective affairs. They limit people to narrow confines, depriving them of access to resources and solidarities through which people could strive to overcome their subalternity. The role of the superstructures, including the way discourses construct and articulate themselves, have to be taken into account to understand why specific modes of exploitation reinforce themselves and to devise ways to overcome the same. Appreciation of the here and now. Ambedkar refused to be influenced by promises or trends of his day. Gandhi left his powerful impress on men and matters of his times. Ambedkar remained no exception, but he refused to budge from the understanding of what he thought were the ground realities. He deeply resented the pressures brought on him on the eve of the Pune Pact and steered clear from what he felt were its unholy embraces as soon as an occasion presented itself. He refused to accept at least advice that he make his peace with the Congress given his electoral setback in 1946, and he defended the claims of the scheduled castes on independent India's political order where others went along with the mainstream. This dogged determination to pursue the causes dear to him wherever he was and under all circumstances without donning the cloak of saint or a renouncer distinguished Ambedkar from most of his contemporaries. These complex issues which Ambedkar explained and defended, although not always to the satisfaction of many and sometimes not as rigorously as record, have continued to claim intellectual and political attention to this day in many societies and especially in India. He also argued that these issues be approached not through the formal positioning but in their discrete articulations through specific investigations and political programs. He was pragmatic in his approach, although not in his concerns. The backward classes, while absorbing the political legacy of Ambedkar, are yet to engage with the understanding that marked their dominant counterparts will probably rest content retaining him merely as a symbol. Conclusion. Dear students, so far we have discussed the social and political views and the major efforts done by Dr. Ambedkar for the upliftment of the socially and economically backward people of the society in India. Ambedkar was a social revolutionary. He vehemently denounced the inequalities. He was a most renowned and the most militant champion of the untouchables. Though his scholarly writings, he made significant awareness of the political, economic and social problems of the untouchable community. Though provocative, his life is highly instructive to everyone who yearns for human dignity and equality in social relations. More than any other Indian, it is he who fought for the cause of the social equality. His ultimate achievements lay in ushering in a silent social revolution in Indian society. He stood for the social liberation, economic emancipation and political advancement of the downtrodden. Ambedkar's other major contribution to Indian progress, his faith in constitutional order. Though he believed in change but stood for change through constitutional method only. The civil disobedience methodology could be a dominance of anarchy, he thought. His contribution as a parliamentarian, scholar, statesman, and a reformer was outstanding. Notably, the chief architect of Indian Constitution also drafted and introduced the Hindu Code Bill to end the complexities of marriage system in India. Thank you.